Okay, so
I see you both the word for the day.
so here we go. Last week we started apologetics and talking about what that discipline is and how it works, and really kind of ran through the version of apologetics that everybody is kind of used to. You sort of debate with unbelievers and you try to persuade them about how to interpret the evidence. And I call that classical or evidence-based apologetics. It's one way of doing it, and we'll come back to that and look at in more detail about how you might use those strategies to deal with unbelief or with your own doubts when they arise. But that's not the only way of doing it. And part of what I tried to establish last week was that in the Bible, there are passages where apologetic discussions take place. And if you read them, what you realize is they don't really work like the way classical apologetics work. They argue in a very different way. Which raises the question, are there other ways of doing this? Are there other ways of doing apologetics besides arguing about the evidence? And the fact is, there is. This week I'm going to introduce you to this. You may not be familiar with this. It's not something that every normal walking around person in the church knows about. But it is increasingly popular on the internet among apologists. It's called presuppositional apologetics, and it takes a very different approach to talking to unbelievers, non-Christians, about the defense of Christian faith. So it's very interesting. I'm going to read from my notes a bit more than I usually do, so just, if you need me to stop, just yell out. So, but I'm going to read because the ideas here they're a little complicated. They may be new to a lot of people, and I want to make sure I say about this what I actually mean instead of just spouting the words out off the top of my head like I do every week. So that's what I'm going to do. So this is going to be even nerdier than usual, but I'm going to read quite a bit of this at you. But if what I say doesn't make sense, you want me to stop, just wave your arms, yell out, I'll stop. So here we go, presuppositional apologetics. First thing is, why is it called presuppositional apologetics? That's a weird name, kind of. What do we mean by that? Well, under this method, God is understood as the necessary presupposition for all true knowledge of reality. Unless you begin your reasoning about reality from God, you will never conclude that there is a God. That's their basic idea. And what that is to say is that the battle in an apologetic conversation is not over the evidence. It's over the set of ideas that you bring to the evidence to interpret the evidence. It's the starting point from which we reason about the evidence. And the central claim of this approach is that there is no neutral position from which anyone can evaluate any kind of evidence, and therefore there's no common ground for the believer and the non-believer to stand on, okay? Classical apologetics assumes we all live in a rational world, we're rational people, the unbeliever and the Christian have the same ideas about rationality and evidence, so all I need to do when I talk to you as the unbeliever is sort of set aside my biased view of the evidence that God exists and join you on the common ground we all live on, where it's an open question whether God exists. And we'll talk about it and we'll reason our way to the conclusion that God exists. Presuppositional says that's not true. It's the whole idea is wrongly conceived. It's not that you, the Christian, have a biased way of looking at the evidence about whether God exists. And everybody who's not a Christian lacks any system of belief and is just sitting around waiting to figure out what the evidence means in some neutral way. They have a different worldview with a different set of assumptions. And as long as you stay in that worldview using those assumptions, you will continue to conclude non-Christian things based on the evidence. Everybody's got a position that they come to the facts from, and that's what you've got to deal with first. Before we start talking about the Bible or science or anything else, we need to get you on the common ground with the believer.
So is this saying that a non-Christian and a Christian, a believer and a non-believer, look at each other and say, I know you don't believe, I understand that, and I know you believe, and I understand that, but I'm still going to hold firm to my position.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you, you're actually never going to be able to reason correctly about anything until you give up your non-Christian beliefs and come onto the ground that the Christian is standing on. Because God created the universe, so God defines what the facts mean. You and your human reason don't get to stand in judgment over the facts and decide what they mean. God tells you. So until you get that, we can't really talk to each other.
So is our very existence the proof of God?
They wouldn't put it that crudely. You'll see it, but you'll see. But it is perceived to be saying that sometimes, and that is one of the problems that this view has. When it's done badly, it's really done badly. Like you end up with some non-starter arguments that are just begging the question entirely. And so to do this, you really need to understand it, and you need to learn how it works. You need to handle it carefully, but I think what you'll see is it can be an incredibly powerful critique, especially of non-Christian beliefs. Okay, so the central frame of this approach is that there's no neutral position from which any of us can evaluate evidence, and therefore no common ground. The Christian presupposes that the God of the Bible exists, and that the propositions revealed in the Bible are true, and the non-Christian presupposes anything else. Given this situation, it's not possible or even desirable for the believer to set aside his or her biased beliefs and assume the objective or the neutral view of the universe, which is neither objective or neutral in reality. Instead, the task of the apologist is to challenge the basis of the non-believer's worldview, expose its incoherence, and invite the non-believer to assume Christian presuppositions, which is the only way to actually understand reality. That's a big set of claims, I know. And it may rub you the wrong way, and that's okay. Because the first time this was ever presented to me, this whole thing really bugged me. This seemed so arrogant and so, like, just insisting that I'm right and you're wrong. It's deeper than that, but if it feels that way, you're getting what I'm saying. I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So you say to invite the non-believer to assume Christian presuppositions?
Yeah.
That to me is asking the moon.
Yes.
Yes.
You're getting it then. This makes a huge set of claims. It really does. It puts some pressure on you, but I'll go through it, I'll demonstrate some of how it works, and you may become more sympathetic to it. I think what you will see is that this makes very powerful critiques of things. Whether how well it works in the end is open to question, but there's usefulness in it, is the argument I'm trying to make by the end of this.
Does it ever work?
Yes. Yes, it does. Some version of presuppositional apologetics, from a human perspective, is frankly the reason I'm not an atheist. I ended up doing a version of presuppositional apologetics on myself as a freshman in college. I really had a crisis with this. Like, do I go to Wheaton College just because I grew up in a Christian family and they sent me to Word of Life Bible camp and I'm just doing what I've been doing, or do I really believe this? Could I be an atheist? If I were an atheist, what would my life look like and how would I explain it? And what I found was that if I were an atheist, the way I would have to view the world would be internally contradictory. I couldn't actually make sense of the world that I perceive based on atheistic presuppositions or assumptions, whatever. I didn't have that vocabulary then. But it was because I came to that conclusion that I decided at the age of 19, I guess I'm a Christian because it's impossible for me to be an atheist. I don't believe those things. I can't believe those things. So this is where I fall. In a lot of ways, that is a presuppositional apologetic approach, and it worked on me. So when I went to grad school and I actually heard this, I realized, oh, this is what I was doing to myself. So I'm very sympathetic to presuppositional apologetics, even if I don't think I'd call myself a presuppositional apologist. So that's where I'm coming from. So if you're a little skeptical, that's good. I'll try to make you less skeptical by the end. Fair enough? So where does it come from? Just to give you a little bit of history on it, it's very closely associated with Reformed theology. These people talk a lot about the sovereignty of God and the total depravity of human nature. That's Reformed thinking. It's closely associated with Westminster Theological Seminary and a man named Cornelius Van Til, who deserves either credit or blame for putting this system of ideas together. And if you were really interested in sort of tracing its philosophical origins, you'd be looking at people like Edmund Husserl, Immanuel Kant, and Martin Heidegger, but you can all relax because I won't talk about those people at all. It's fine. Key practitioners would be this Van Til guy, a man named Greg Bahnsen, who was one of his first generation of students, very articulate, persuasive speaker, dead now, but he was a major figure. And then John Frame, who is, I think, retired, but still standing up and talking back, so he's more current than Van Til or Bahnsen, so that's good. But those are the people you would hear a lot as major figures in this field. So now to start to talk about some of the system of thought behind it. What are the things that it assumes? And I did this last week. Kind of three assumptions with apologetics. Assumptions about theology, assumptions about epistemology, which is how we learn things. What is the warrant for saying you know something or you don't know something? And then assumptions about apologetics and how you want to do it. If I had to characterize it in one phrase, I would say the assumptions are about the fact that total depravity means total depravity. Human nature is fallen and that affects everything that we do. And if you don't understand that, you won't be able to effectively meet objections to Christianity. So theologically, what they'll say is that the fall affects everything about human nature, including our rational faculties. Our system of thought is affected by our sinfulness. Until and unless we are regenerated by the Holy Spirit, we will try to use our rationality as a weapon against God, to justify ourselves and to overthrow God's sovereignty. And if you look at the book of Genesis, how does the serpent start off tempting Adam and Eve? Did God really say that this was going to happen? He starts questioning what God has revealed as a way of turning it around on God or the believer. Is that really what he said? Do you really believe that? Using it as a self-justification or an excuse to do what you want or something like that. Rationality is used to attack God and his sovereignty. And these people will argue, that is what unregenerate human rationality is always going to do. It's going to try to take God off of the throne of the universe and put me on the throne. So, yeah.
But does that paragraph in essence say God wants us to defer logic?
That would be another objection to this, that they seem to be saying that. They're not saying that. They're just saying, until and unless you are a Christian, you're going to misuse logic over and over again to discredit God, to make yourself.
It's not denying logic.
No, it's very important. They will use evidence to argue for God. They just don't start from the evidence.
Okay.
First thing they do is talk about the system of thought that you look at the evidence with. They'll try to overthrow that in the unbeliever and invite them to try Christianity and see how it works. That's kind of the idea. So epistemology, their assumptions, because human rationality is fallen and sinful, the phrase they use is that there is an absolute antithesis between non-Christian belief and Christian belief. They disagree about everything. There is no common ground, and that's always the way it's going to be. This is one of their assumptions. Whether you agree with that or not really important right now, but that is one of the things they assume. Unregenerate human reason is dead in sin and powerless for leading us to true knowledge about God. So in terms of apologetics, the assumption is the believer cannot and must not appeal to rationality and common grace as the primary tools for getting an unbeliever to conclude that God exists. Those tools won't work because they're going to be used against God, in rebellion to God, and you're never going to end up where you need to go. As long as the non-believer is committed to the pursuit of autonomous learning and thinking, that I make my decisions, nothing is revealed to me, he will always use those tools to suppress the truth and undermine God's authority over him. Apologetics has to begin then by disabusing the non-believer of his or her attempts to reason on their own non-Christian worldview. Only when autonomy has been abandoned is it possible to accept the revealed truth of God. Does that make sense? That's the problem they see and the beginning of how they want to deal with it. So the practice of it, one way that it's described is as a sort of a two-part discussion. The first part they call disclosure. And disclosure is where the Christian demonstrates to the non-believer that all of their objections to Christianity are either self-justifications or they refute themselves, they're self-defeating ideas, or they're based on concepts that frankly are stolen from Christianity and don't really make any sense unless you're a Christian. Morality is one thing they'll talk about with that. So
who is allowing these barriers? Is it the individual who says, I know better, so this is how I feel, and you have to that has to be removed as offense.
Yeah.
It has to be, you have to think kind of outside the box.
Yes. This idea that I'm autonomous in itself, that I get to make the decisions. There's a universe out there and I get to decide what it means. That's asserting that I have autonomy about how to think about things, which is a rejection of the idea that God made the universe and he gets to tell us what the facts mean. We should be learning from what is revealed to us and beginning there, not from the idea that I'm on the throne and I get to make my own decisions about the facts. So that's how they want to do this. Does that make some sense? If it makes some sense, I'm going to walk you through a dialogue now and try to show you what it might look like, one instance of this. So let's imagine that we've got a dialogue going on between a non-Christian and a Christian. I'm just gonna read this out to you. Now, I built this argument, so I've baked victory in from the beginning because I want to make sure you understand how it works. So it would never be quite this easy, but this is disclosure and homecoming right here, what you'll see. So the non-Christian might begin the conversation. He presents his objection to Christian belief. He says, it's foolish to believe fairy tales about the creation of the universe. No thinking person should base their understanding of reality on a bunch of stories that some Bronze Age peasants stole from other Bronze Age peasants, when modern scientific inquiry has proven again and again that it gives us a true understanding of reality. Okay? So this is an assertion of human autonomy. Don't listen to Bronze Age peasants. Listen to modern science. We know how the universe works and we can tell you what the facts mean. That's how a reasonable person ought to look at the universe. So the non-Christian hears this and says, okay, that's an interesting idea, but I think I see a problem with your approach. And so the non-Christian returns, especially if they were on the internet. Oh, what's the problem? No sky daddy? They love that on the internet. God is your bearded sky daddy, and his answer for everything, Jesus did it. So contempt, you'll hear a lot of that. And the answer, I think, would be from a presuppositionalist, well, yes. Okay, that is the problem. You don't account for God in your reasoning, but I'll get to that. I don't want to start there. I want to start someplace else. First, I think there's a problem built into your proposal, and that problem actually seems to make your proposal impossible. So the non-Christian says, how? How can it be impossible to use science to understand the universe? Okay, so here's a little bit of a word trick that I did. Okay. So the Christian says, well, you weren't talking about just any old thing in the universe. Go back to what you said. You said the creation of the universe, the beginning of the universe. That, I think, is where your problem starts. So the non-Christian says, well, whatever, who cares? Okay, so now let's walk through this. The Christian says, well, here's the thing. Science has shown, conclusively at this point, background radiation of the universe, all of that stuff, the Big Bang is true. As far as we can tell, there was a Big Bang. That means the whole universe began to exist at some point. Now, when we say that, technically what we mean is matter, space, energy, and time all began to exist at some point. If matter, space, energy, and time all had a beginning, and that beginning corresponds with the beginning of the universe, then neither space, nor matter, nor energy, nor time can play any role in our explanation of the beginning of the universe. Because those things would have had to exist before they existed to cause their own creation. Okay? Do you get the problem there? you can't have it that way. That's a problem because science only studies matter, space, energy, and time. It doesn't deal with anything else but those things. So I think you're wrong in trying to answer this question about the beginning of the universe using those tools. They're not the right tools. Science won't get you to that answer because it only deals with things that can't have caused the beginning of the universe, and it had a beginning. So the non-Christian will definitely respond to this with something like, oh great, here we go with the ontological argument again, and we all know that that's not true. Except that's not the argument that's being made. Yeah.
See, but you know, I went through this myself as a kid.
Yeah.
Thinking through the whole thing when I hear both scientists talk and preacher types
Yeah.
talking. And when you look at the rationality, you not only get to there's stuff when there wasn't any stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no concept of who's even thinking about this. Why would there even be stuff?
Yeah.
And who would even conceive of the idea of thinking about it, whether it's there or not?
That basic question.
So you go even further, there's stuff, why should there even be the thought of stuff?
Right. Why is there something,
Who's
not
doing the
nothing?
thinking?
Yeah. And our whole idea of nothing is wrong. Whatever intuitively you're thinking when you think of nothing, you're thinking of the wrong thing. Because probably what you're thinking of is a big giant room that's empty. That's not nothing.
Right.
That's a big giant room. Nothing isn't. Nothing isn't something, it just isn't. Nothing existed. No time, no matter, no space, no energy. Even scientists will say, as soon as I start to talk about this, I don't know what I'm talking about. Because the language doesn't even work for the concept. It's very complicated. But this is the problem I think that they run into in this conversation. So the non-Christian will be dismissive of this, and then the Christian will say, well, that's not what I'm saying. It's not a version of the ontological argument, that things exist, the existence of things requires a God, therefore God exists. That's not their point. What he's saying is, your proposal to use science to investigate the beginning of the universe just simply won't work. You have no tools for answering the question where the universe came from. In fact, it would be absurd to try and use this question, or answer this question using the tools that you want to use, because they're ruled out as candidates by logic itself. It's a non-starter. That's the whole argument. If you want to be rational about this, you're going to have to get off of science. There's going to have to be another way you know things. So that's, and then the non-Christian's going to say, what, a sky daddy? Well, yeah, that is the argument the presuppositional is going to make. You're going to need God to make this work. So far what we've seen is the disclosure part, okay? That's the non-Christian basically going on the attack, saying, hang on a second, we'll talk about your objection to my beliefs in a second. First, we need to talk about the fact that your beliefs don't work. They're going to defeat themselves. If you've got no ground to stand on now, because this won't work, the only other thing in this conversation is my ground. So try it out. I invite you to come home. Try Christian presuppositions, look at the universe, and see if at least they make sense, okay? So they might say something like this: if God exists, then there is an explanation for the beginning of the universe that's neither matter, nor space, nor energy, nor time. It's God, okay? We don't have that problem. That is still a live possibility as the explanation. So what we've got there is a hypothesis. The universe exists because God created it. We can test that hypothesis out by looking at the data. We could look at the evidence, the universe, the thing we're trying to understand, and see if all of the stuff that exists or behaves in a way that is consistent with this hypothesis. What would we expect if we lived in a universe that was created by a God? Well, here are some things we might expect. We might expect it to have been built so that it works in a certain way. It would have predictable laws that make things happen. It would contain something instead of nothing. It wouldn't just be a big empty room. And among the somethings that it would contain probably would be life. Living things would be better than just rocks. And among the life, intelligent life we might expect to emerge. As God is clearly intelligent, we would expect him to make some beings that are intelligent. And some of those beings might at least try to use their intelligence to glorify God. Well, is this starting to sound like any universe you've ever heard of? Kind of sounds like our universe. It has definable rules and laws, logic, physics, chemistry. It predictably works in certain ways. There are things instead of no things. There is intelligent life. Humans, this is the Westminster Catechism. Chief end of man, glorify God and enjoy him forever. The universe in a lot of ways does line up with what Christianity is claiming. Another thing that we might expect to observe would be that the phenomena that occur in the universe would be understandable. They would be subject to laws. They would ensure their predictability and repeatability. We see this in science all the time. That is to say, as in, science would work to explain how things work inside the universe, even if it can't explain why there are things in the first place. So science is still useful. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You want to do science, science can still be useful to us, but it can't be useful in explaining where everything came from. It can be useful in a narrower sense, in a more defined sense within the universe. if everything we observe is consistent with the kind of expectations that we might have about a God-created universe, then maybe our hypothesis works. At any rate, in the absence of some other way to examine this question, you, the non-Christian, as we've already seen, don't seem to have another way of looking at this. So it starts to look like maybe I, as the Christian, have the better explanation. Yours won't work. Mine comports with what we see in the world. Maybe you ought to look further at this. Maybe you're coming at it the wrong way. You can keep calling what I do superstition if you want, but there are other ways of knowing things besides science. I've carried that point here. And I think Gerard Manley Hopkins, if you know him, great English poet, God's Grandeur is a poem he wrote. The first lines are, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men now not wreck his rod?" The world is pregnant with evidence, if only you will see it, that God exists. His glory is built into the world around you. If you will just see it, you can know it in other ways besides science. The experience of the world. It's not science that brought Gerard Manley Hopkins to write that. It's his experience of the world and his experience of God. He knew things that way. And I think it's interesting that his conclusion is, why don't men obey you if they can see this? This is the point the presuppositional apologists want to make. They're rebels against God. They don't wreck God's rod, his ability to punish misbehavior. They don't wreck it. That's like reckless. You don't care, you don't pay attention. You are without wreck. that's what people are. So the point being, there are other ways of knowing things besides what you can do in a laboratory or an observatory, and you should try them. That's the homecoming part, what we've done. The universe does actually comport with what Christianity suggests. So come over onto the same ground with me and examine the evidence from that perspective. See that this works. Something like that. That's what they call a transcendental argument. The transcendental argument for God. God transcends science. It does things science can't do. Without God, you don't even have science. That's how they do it. So does that make sense? Yeah.
What about the thought that we don't understand it, but there's a thing called nature,
Mm-hmm.
and nature unfolded, not a thinking thing, but a process. Can that explain? Can the scientists use that argument? You believe that it's a prescient entity that relates to us, for us, and me as a scientist say that's a process that I don't understand, and I can't understand it, just like an ant can understand why it's on a safe spot versus other ants being killed. It's just beyond my comprehension. Can that argument work?
What they would say is, look, science works. My point isn't that science is not my enemy as a presuppositionalist. Science is something that exists because God made us rational. He gave us common grace. Even people who are not Christians can accurately know some things about the universe, but not everything. Science can, in a limited sense, explain the reality of certain facts, and even how certain facts are related to each other. But when scientists start to go beyond that, and say that I'm a scientist, therefore I'm an expert on the existence of God, they're way out over their skis. That's not what science is built to do. It can't answer those kinds of questions. And so science is useful, but only in certain ways. It's not the whole way of knowing things. There are other ways to do it, and you have to remain open to that. Yeah.
Can I propose perhaps not a different answer, an analog answer?
Yeah.
If your argument is there's a thing called nature, and there's an element of nature that our brains can't understand, and that's the element that created the universe, my argument would be, why is that unknowing element of nature any different than the unknowing power of God? Our brains are equally incapable of understanding either. So I would argue that with this.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that because you run into this fallacy that you'll get hammered with, called the God of the gaps fallacy. And what people will sometimes do is they'll look at science and they'll look at all the things where scientists still have questions. They haven't figured out X, Y, and Z things. And they'll go, okay, so X is God, Y is God, Z is God. There are gaps, I'll fill them in with God. Problem is,
Until
science,
I rationalize
yeah,
it.
science is going to keep doing what it's doing, and its rules say I'm going to explain everything without reference to God. Eventually, scientists will say it's because of this. Then they destroy faith. So you got to be careful with a God of the gaps approach. You can't let it become that. I don't think that's what you mean.
Yeah.
But a lot of these things can turn into things you don't mean for them to be, and you got to be careful. So that's the idea. Science is real. It's true. It's not the enemy. But it's limited, like everything else is limited.
The first step causing that non-believer to be at least not a non-believer or a believer, but an agnostic.
Yeah, I think that's where you would at least want to get them to. You would want to loosen their grip on scientism,
To admit
we
that
might
there
call it.
could be a God.
Right. Okay. I can see it's a logical impossibility that science could explain the beginning of a universe, because it only studies the stuff in the universe. There's no way to get behind that with science and explain any of it. So if it won't work, it's the wrong tool, and if it's the wrong tool, you need to try a different one.
Yeah,
Well,
all you
here's
have
one
to
that can work.
believe is that out of nothing came something. If you can believe that.
Right. If you can have one giant absurd miracle first, you can explain everything else with
Exactly.
science. Yeah. So that's the problem. So, okay, so just to sort of review, what happened in this dialogue that I read at you? Did I disprove science? No, I did not disprove science. I didn't even try to disprove science. In fact, I used science as part of my argument several times. Science is not the enemy here. Did I prove the existence of God? I did not prove the existence of God. What I did was, well, it doesn't matter. The point is, we can't both be right. The non-Christian and the Christian can't both be right at the same time. I've shown one of us is wrong, but that doesn't mean I can't be wrong too. I mean, logically, this does not amount to a proof of anything. It amounts to a suggestion that my explanation is better than yours. Proof hasn't come anywhere yet. So I wouldn't want to claim about presuppositional apologetics that it disproves God or proves God. I don't think it does either of those things. I think a lot of presuppositionalists would tell you that I'm an idiot, and possibly not even a Christian if I say that about presuppositional apologetics, but I don't think it is. I think it's a very powerful argument. It really puts the unbeliever on his back foot. And a lot of apologetics doesn't do that. I think that's the benefit of it. But it's not a disproof or a proof. It's an argument. It's an inference to the best explanation kind of thing. So what did happen? There was disclosure. First, I tried to show that science isn't the right set of tools for answering every kind of question, and this objection raises one of those questions that science won't answer. And then I offered my competing methodology, Christian belief, as a better way of moving forward. Does that make sense? I know there's a lot of odd ideas, and some of it may feel like word games, things like that, but this is how it works. This is what presuppositional apologetics does. And it doesn't just work with science. It works with all different kinds of ideas that you could use to object to Christianity. This is just the one that I picked, because that happened to be top of my mind again.
Bill, do you think in any way whatsoever that this could be planting a tiny seed in the non-believer to turn them from their solid beliefs and maybe crack that a little bit?
I think that's got to be the hope of the presuppositional apologetic. That's the first thing they have to do, because according to their own system, we can't really talk to each other. We don't have the same starting point. All I can do is maybe lie to you and tell you, yeah, I think there's common ground when I really don't, and have a discussion that I don't really believe in. What you actually have to do first, they will say, is set the evidence aside. We're not ready for the evidence yet. You want to talk about the evidence right off the bat, Mr. Scientist, but we can't do that yet, because we don't even agree about how to look at the evidence. First, we have to have that argument. And what I'm going to try to do is make you give up whatever your presuppositions are, because they don't work. They refute themselves. You have to steal your ideas from Christianity for them to work. They don't make sense in your worldview. You're just trying to justify yourself, something like that. So that's the idea. Stop the non-Christian thinking first, then we can look at the evidence and you can make a decision.
Yeah, and if you're going into a top-level scientist, that top-level scientist will use the logic, and when you force them to consider that their logic works against them, not for them. So you're not denying their skill set, you're asking them to use it.
Yeah, and you're showing that it won't do what you want it to do. You're actually, a lot of times, you're going to say you want to be a non-Christian because it's more rational. What's going to emerge when you look at it is that everything you do to be a rational non-Christian turns out to be completely irrational. You want to examine the beginning of matter, space, energy, and time.
And you have to defy it with faith.
Yeah.
So they have to use faith a different way.
Yes. That's, all of those things are... See, this really does work extremely well. The problem is every set of beliefs falls apart along certain fault lines. You poke them hard enough and they always will. There's always a problem. This happens all the time. This is why, I mean, look at the humanities in universities. This is why from the 70s to the late 90s, postmodernism and deconstruction took over the world in the humanities departments of universities. They make these same kinds of deconstructive arguments. It's all based on a set of assumptions that work against themselves, and you gotta give it up. It really is a very powerful way to critique other people's beliefs. That's the part about this that I think it's important for us to understand, because I'm not even really sure this should be thought of as a kind of apologetics. Remember the definition of apologetics? A defense of the faith. Really, to me, presuppositional apologetics is not that concerned about defending Christian faith. What it's best at is attacking non-Christian faith. It's polemics more than it is anything else. I think as a believer, understanding how this works can ultimately become an effective way of defending your faith. Because when you hear objections, you can take them apart and you can show this is not really a problem from a Christian perspective. You can work around them. But on its face, first of all, what I think what presuppositional apologetics is an attack on everything other than Christianity. And it's pretty shrewd in the way that it does it. It's pretty effective in the way that it does it. So, overall strengths of presuppositional apologetics, it considers the effect of sin on human reason and treats fallen human nature as a real barrier to belief in God. And I sometimes think classical apologetics does not do that. We can all reason together, it's fine. Your sin is not going to get in the way of you believing in God. I'll just talk to you like I talk to anybody else. I think that's naive. I'm not saying every non-Christian is self-consciously, intentionally rebelling against God, but a lot of them are. There is something to that. And presuppositional apologetics puts that at the front of the discussion, which I think is worthwhile. It insists that direct revelation must be the foundation of all rational thought. It could be overstated, but as Christians, God has revealed things to us about himself and the world and us and how we're supposed to live in it. We should begin there. That's a good idea. It's not just something we tack on to all of the other stuff that we believe. It's the foundation of what we believe. It's supposed to be, if we really believe it. That's good in presuppositional apologetics. And it directly challenges the validity of unbelief. It presses the attack. Like I've been saying, it tries to offer a critique of non-Christian thought by showing that non-Christians can't arrive at coherent conclusions about reality without stealing ideas from Christianity that can't be defended within non-Christian epistemology. Yeah.
Before you go on, what does direct revelation mean in that point?
Sorry, yes, direct revelation, what I mean by that is the Bible. It's what's been revealed to us directly. Special revelation, theologians will call it. Special revelation is probably actually what I meant. Direct revelation. Yeah, that's a bad word choice. Direct revelation would be actual, it would be Moses talking to God directly on Mount Sinai. Special revelation is scripture, and that's what I mean there. So, but if the best defense is a good offense, then in that sense, I do think presuppositional apologetics is better than every other kind of apologetics, because it relentlessly attacks unbelief, and that really changes the tenor of the conversation. So I think those are the strengths. Yeah.
My understanding of direct revelation is that's the revelation that we see around us.
That'd be general revelation typically.
That general revelation.
Yeah. Direct would be God appears to you and says, here's the word of the Lord. What prophets experience would be direct revelation. And then special revelation would include direct revelation as well as scripture.
So how does general revelation fit into these theologians?
General revelation would be science. So it's not the enemy. It is used against Christian belief. But it isn't inherently the enemy of Christianity. It's something God has blessed us all with. It's why we have, surgery and pharmaceuticals and flush toilets and all of the things that help us live our lives. It's good, but it's limited. It's not salvific. It's not even intended to bring you to belief in God necessarily. It's special revelation, scripture, the ministry of the Holy Spirit, the regeneration of your heart. That stuff, that's ultimately what makes you a believer. And you're going to need both, is what they would say.
The problem that I see is that if you are not born into a Christian-based society,
how are you going to do this?
How can a gracious, loving God condemn 3/4 of the world to hell because they don't have an opportunity to have general or special revelation?
Right. This is one of the places where people do start to disagree with presuppositional apologetics. They can state some of these things so forcefully that you run into some of these problems. Now, some of your objection is really not to presuppositional apologetics, it's to Calvinism, which is a whole other conversation we don't have time for right now. I would say take some of that up with John Calvin. But yeah, general revelation needs to be important. It needs to stay important. And one of the weaknesses with presuppositional apologetics is that the way it gets used can turn into it's the enemy. And it can never work. It does nothing. It's ineffective. You don't even need to think about it or know about it. That's where it can go sideways and turn into something that's very ineffective. You have to be able to hold on to both of them as significant and meaningful. It's just that they need to be used in a certain way. Rationality works, but it only really works when it's under the control of Christian belief, when it's unfettered, autonomous human reason. Then it becomes the enemy, because it's going to be used to attack God, to try to become God, like God yourself, something like that. That's their argument, anyway. So that's what runs in the trouble. So weaknesses on presuppositional apologetics. To be totally honest with you, the most pressing reasons for rejecting this rely on objections to a whole bunch of philosophical ideas from people like Husserl and Kant and Heidegger, which you really don't want me to get into, so I will not. But they're real objections, and I want to say that because I'm sympathetic to presuppositional apologetics, but I don't want this to sound like a commercial for it, because I do recognize it has problems. Those objections are real, and if you want to get into them, you will see they're meaningful. I just can't do it this morning, and I don't think it's a good idea for any of us for me to do it. It would take 3 weeks, and you wouldn't care at the end anyway. So, but there are problems, they're not inconsequential, and it isn't a perfect system, although there's a lot I do like about it. More easily understood objections might include things like a refusal to acknowledge any kind of common ground with the non-Christian, this absolute antithesis idea, does kind of raise the question, how are any of us supposed to talk to each other at all? If it's a total antithesis, so that we can't understand the facts in the same way, are we even going to understand words in the same way? Or are you just going to use words as a tool to attack God? Why am I even talking to you? It begins to undermine itself, its own usefulness at some point, if you take it too seriously. And a lot of some of presuppositional apologetics will try to change that terminology. It's not an absolute antithesis, but it's whatever I said here, a radical distinction, or in principle, there is an absolute antithesis, something like that. But that's a weakness with this. Why would you do apologetics at all? If there's really a total inability of the two sides to talk together and no common ground, then just walk away. you made apologetics useless. The insistence on the supremacy of direct revelation over human reason can begin to sound like it winds up with viciously circular arguments like, I don't believe the Bible is true. Well, the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true. Therefore, God exists. That would be a viciously circular argument that doesn't work at all. Presuppositional apologetics does not mean to argue in that way, but when people are not skilled at it, they do often end up with arguments like that. So you have to watch out for that. And then it talks about these transcendental arguments for God. Morality is one type of argument for God that's a transcendental argument. It says that, look, we all think there are moral facts and obligations in the universe. Everybody thinks that. The problem for the unbeliever is none of those things make any sense in a material universe with no God. There's no purpose to anything. So there's no reason that you should or shouldn't do anything, because it's not going anywhere. It just happens. It's just random events. The whole idea of morality is pointless without a God to establish what it is and to enforce it. So if you believe that the universe has moral facts in it, you must also believe that it has a God in it, because God transcends morality. It's the precondition for morality. Without a God, you can't really have a workable system of morality. That doesn't mean non-Christians can't do moral things. They can. It just means they don't really have a reason for the moral things that they do. Doesn't actually make sense if the universe has no God. Okay, you did a nice thing for somebody, but I don't know what that means. What's nice even mean? Like, if there's just stuff colliding, doesn't mean anything. So it uses those kinds of arguments, and in philosophy, especially in the last probably 3 or 4 decades, those ideas, they were kind of developed by Kant and seen as very useful arguments. They're seen as less important right now, less convincing right now by philosophers. And it's just not clear where that's going to go. Whether they will be rehabilitated as far as philosophers are concerned, I don't know. But it's a thing people will object to when you make these transcendental kind of presuppositions. So, that's what I got on presuppositional apologetics. I know it's a lot to introduce, and it's been an hour. So, what I did here at the end was, there are some links here to some YouTube videos. Like this week, if you want to think more about this, go watch some of these videos and hear the way these people argue. See how much more you can understand about it, and see how well you think it works. I've got guy named James White. He's currently active as an apologist. That's his profession. A couple of short videos, 6-7 minutes, where he explains how presuppositional apologetics works. Pretty good snapshot of what's going on from him. He's very serious about presuppositional apologetics. I have 2 debates with this Greg Bonson guy. One against a scientist. This is from the late 80s, so if you go to it, it's just a recording. There's no video of it because it's from like 1989. But it's very famous on the internet because he wrecks this guy. Like, it's very clear. Presuppositional apologetics was kind of new on the scene when Bonson had this debate. And Stein is not prepared for what Bonson is doing at all. He's discombobulated often. He really sort of just one rake after another he steps on and gets whacked in the face over and over again. So it's quite a debate. It's, kind of dry and technical, but it's a great explanation of what the presuppositionalist believes and how they argue. There's another one, Greg Bonson and R.C. Sproul, who is a Christian pastor who's not a presuppositionalist, and they have a debate about which is better. And it's a very collegial conversation. Again, this is 30 years ago, so it's a recording. There's no video to watch with it, but really good conversation, productive, interesting conversation where you get reinforcements about what the arguments are on both sides. And then last, I gave him a link to a man named David Berlinski, who I connect with presuppositional apologetics, but he's not a Christian or a presuppositionalist. He's a secular Jewish mathematician, but he is awesome. He's got a dry sense of humor. He's very witty, and he loves a fight. And he sees in sort of science a bunch of bullies who need to get punched in the mouth. And he's really good at just undressing some of these things. Really, really good. He's talking about, there's one interview where he's talking about this book that I recommend, The Devil's Delusion. And he's talking about evolution and Darwinism and stuff like that. And he says, well, his point is, it's a theory that doesn't make much sense at all, and it's supported by almost no evidence. And the guy he's talking to goes, well, what do you mean by that? Unpack that. He says, well, you go to the Museum of Natural History in New York, and you see these beautiful explanations of how evolution works, and it's this animal, and then this animal, and another animal, and it's amazing, but what's between the animals? And the guy goes, arrows. He goes, okay. And where were the arrows discovered? Like, he's so witty, like he's very quick. He's got a good way of delivering things. And what he's trying to do is show that this group of people, their system, you get told that it will explain everything. But if you really think about it, in a lot of ways, it lacks any kind of explanatory power. And smart people are allowed to say that. And they're allowed to make these points without being superstitious or unreasonable or anything else. He's really good for that. And to do presuppositional apologetics, learning the kinds of arguments that Berlinski makes is really, really useful.
And couldn't everything you said today be applied by a rabbi talking to a group of kids who say they don't believe in God?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, presuppositional apologists would say not really, because presuppositional apologetics will only ever defend Christian theism and nothing else.
Right, but I'm saying it's a first step.
Yeah. Something like this you could employ. So that's the way it works. I'd really encourage you, try these out. The Berlinski one is fun to watch. The other debates, they're a little drier, but you really will get a master class in how this stuff works. So worth thinking about. At least the James White one. You get a very clear, quick explanation of what this stuff is. Think it over. I think he's going to have one more type next week, and then after that we'll start to get into, I'll take on some specific objections that you guys have emailed me. Ron sent me several, if you come up with any, these questions about belief, the Bible, science, whatever, cosmology, arguments against Christianity, email it to me. I'll spend several weeks after this trying to kind of deal with some of these and show how some of these different schools of thought could be used to defend Christian belief. So we have one more called Reformed Apologetics next week, or Reformed Epistemology next week, and then we'll get into that. So there you go. Thank you.